All right, so we'll get into it. Again, you've probably seen many of these slides already, but we want to be sure that we're connecting everything that we do in these sessions to the big picture of an equitable multi-level system of support. Because what we believe to be true at the RTI Center and what we see working is when schools don't just implement PBIS as a standalone silo, but when they implement the PBIS components and framework as part of a bigger picture. So you'll hear us highlight multiple key system features throughout this session, but today we chose to connect specifically to equity, strategic use of data, and strong universal or tier 1 level. And just a reminder, again, you've probably heard this multiple times, but equity is at the center of our framework because it's really embedded into all other key system features. Without considering all of those key system features through the lens of equity, we will never challenge or change the inequitable access, opportunity, and outcomes that we have in Wisconsin right now. Since equity is at the center of the framework, you'll hear it embedded throughout this session. So you may see this symbol, and if we didn't add it to a slide, just know it probably connects because it's kind of what this whole presentation is about. Also, the 5 factors resource connects to this session distinctly because when we talk about sustaining implementation of an equitable multi-level system of support, we know that there are specific things that we can do as teams and as leaders and as implementers to ensure that that work sticks. So we are connected to that as well through the use of data, examining and sharing data. And if you want to look more into that 5 factors resource, that is available on our website. Comes our learning the value of disaggregating data, identifying common data that you might disaggregate, and we want you to get some practice looking for patterns that will show you who is going to succeed and who is going to fail in a given setting. So just to be clear, to come back and ground ourselves in our definition of equity, educational equity, and this is what we define all of our work around in the RTI Center and at DPI, educational equity means that every student has access to the resources and educational rigor that they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, ethnicity, language, ability, sexual orientation, family background, or family income. So when we talk about equity in this broad sense, we want you to remember that we are always bringing it back to this core definition, and that's really what we mean when we address equity in any of our sessions. So for now, we're going to dig a little deeper into equity. This is our model to inform culturally responsive practices in Wisconsin. And by participating in this session, you're digging deeper specifically into this yellow section, which is the will, desire to lead section. And specifically, we're going to work on the system's impact on families and students portion. So we offer a 5-day training that goes through this whole model. And we know that this is not work that just you go around the circle once and it's done, you've completed it, you're equitable and culturally responsive. But we know that that's a journey. So in our training, we talk about what you might do in each of these sections, and we really emphasize the fact that for this work to work, we have to keep looking at it, keep investigating, keep looking at our data. This is not a one and done type of thing. We have to really just keep our eye on whether or not our systems are meeting the needs of our students. So that training is called Building Culturally Responsive Systems, and if you want more information on that, you can message Jill, or I see Kent or Kate, or email us. So an intentional focus on equity accounts for and adapts to the diversity of learners and families that are served by Wisconsin schools. And we do hear sometimes that our schools are not very diverse in Wisconsin, especially in the region of the state that Jill and I work in. We have some smaller districts that tend to have student populations that look very similar, very white, if I'm going to be honest. And what we know is that there actually is a great deal of diversity in Wisconsin. And even a few students in each district, even by not meeting their needs, we're contributing to a pattern of inequity that we see across the state. So this work matters for everyone. To become equitable, schools and educators engage in a journey of deep an honest examination of who they are. So if you attended the last session that Kent and I did, which was H3, we talked about how to lead your staff through that deep examination of their individual identities and the importance of that work. We have to acknowledge that our beliefs, individual beliefs and assumptions about learners and families, is part of how our systems are built. So we also have to consider what those beliefs, what those assumptions value and affirm, and what they don't. And our wish for you is that we all have an intentional focus on equity. So there's some research that suggests that more generic consciousness of inequality can actually be deadening for both educators and students, unless we pinpoint concrete, targeted ways to counteract those inequities. So we have to intentionally not only focus on equity and come back to it all of the time, but we have to also be sure that we're taking concrete, actionable steps to address those inequities. So we're going to talk today about some tools for discussing equity and specifically for disaggregating data. We've included some agreements that you might want to consider as you're starting this work, because what you can find through disaggregating data can feel deeply personal and often does. You may experience moments of discomfort, or you may experience moments where your staff, the people you're working with, are uncomfortable. It's very important to recognize and lean into these agreements. So today I want you to think to yourself and also think about how you might use these agreements in another setting. But ask these as a question for yourself. Can we commit to noticing moments of discomfort and staying curious? Listening fully with our ears, our eyes, and our heart. Speaking our truth without blame or judgment, and being open to the experience and each other. So now that we've talked about those norms a little bit, I want you to think for a moment about times when you and your teams examine data. Do conversations around data in your district or your building tend to resemble the statements that are in pink here, underperforming, describing, deflecting, or those that are in the green, underserving and inspecting and reflecting? I can tell you from experience that conversations that resemble the words in the pink are much more comfortable to have, because the locus of control with those conversations is on students and families. So when we use terms like underperforming, what we're doing is creating a sense of helplessness. We're assuming that our job as educators is merely to provide access to an education, rather than to ensure that our students get an education and that they're successful. By shifting our language and shifting our thinking to using terms like underserving and being introspective, we maintain our power in the school system and automatically shift planning to those things that are under our control. So things like homework policies, discipline procedures, even parent-teacher conference attendance. Those things all shift back to what can we do to ensure that we get the outcomes that we want to have, not what have they done to give us these poor outcomes. So the language that you see in the green reflects a belief that it is our responsibility as educators to ensure that students learn. There are a number of ways to address this in your system, but as a start, I want to encourage you to build a specific focus on that inspection and reflection into your team meeting norms. So you could use that focus to examine either the protocols you use in team meetings, or you might even have someone on your team with a dedicated role of listening to ensure that your language is staying true to inspection and reflection. So I think that this slide I think has been in a presentation already today, because I saw it on the app. I like to follow that feed. So I'll tell you my story about how this fits with me. My family loves to give me hanging baskets for Mother's Day each year. And I love that they think of me and that they love me that way. Unfortunately, my ability to keep things alive is limited to a certain number of things, and that includes my children, and some days the cats, and most of the time the dog. So I'm maxed out on the keeping things alive list. And I typically fall short where plants are concerned. Luckily, my kids this summer have taken on this task as sort of an extended Mother's Day gift. They're keeping the plants alive, and they manage to make sure that the plants are watered and that they're cared for, but occasionally a plant or two looks a little wilty and it's not flowering quite right, and then they talk to me about how they think it's dying and they're really scared because they don't want to ruin it, obviously. So when that happens, we don't talk about how the plant is broken and we hate the plant and the plant is making a problem. We talk about whether or not the plant is getting enough water. We talk about whether or not the plant is getting enough sun and what the soil in the hanging bucket thing looks like. Those are the conversations we have. If I knew the language for hanging bucket thing, my plants might have a better chance. I'll just put that out there. So by blaming the hanging plant, doesn't make a lot of sense. So instead, we have to think about how to change the environment to help it be healthier. The same is true of students. We first need to examine the data and see how well our yard or our practices are supporting our flowers or our children to grow and maintain. So let's think about all the places we can access data. We're going to have you complete a quick poll question. And what we'd like you to do is answer where you currently access data to determine if your system is cheating on you. We want you to mark all of them that apply. And
82% of the people have voted, so I'm going to end the poll now. And here are the results.
Wow.
Yes, you can see a local data warehouse has the majority of the responses, followed closely by Skyward. And people are accessing WiseDash. That's awesome.
Yes.
Since it's free.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. So we know that you have data accessible to you. And now we're going to think about, we're going to use that data. We're going to hope that you tie into that thinking as we walk through how we would disaggregate data. So before we begin that though, we're going to examine some overall Wisconsin data to see if our bigger, greater system is cheating on us or is giving us outcomes that we don't want despite our good intentions. So this data is from 2018, 2019, and you can see that it's a 6-year rate. Overall, 92% of our students graduate. That sounds great. Way to go, Wisconsin. However, when you dig deeper and disaggregate the data, I want you to look at how some of our student populations specifically are doing. So our students with disabilities, only 80% graduated. Only 75% of students who are English learners, 82% of students who are American Indian, and 76% of students who identify themselves as Black. To learn more about disaggregating data, we're going to isolate race in completing high school in Wisconsin because we see that that's a very distinct gap. So in WiseDash, we can get a super cool graph like this and isolate race and begin disaggregating our data. But this graph might not help us identify if our system is cheating on us. So what we might need to do is look a little bit deeper and a little bit more closely at just the data for students who are Black and students who are white. If we take that same data from the last slide and put it into Excel for just Black and white students, we begin to see a clearer picture. So we can see that the graduation rate for Black students is holding steady at about 75%, while the graduation rate for white students is holding steady at about 95%. And you can see that this is happening over time. This is something that is not changing. However, it's also at this point that frequently when we have conversations like this about race and data, we have people say, I think it's really just about poverty. So maybe you've heard that before. What we want to do is check on that before we move on. So the Disproportionality Technical Assistance Network gathered some data and they built these slides that we're grateful to have to share with you today that talk a little bit about that poverty question. So we know that it's common to want to think the race-based achievement gap is actually about poverty. There's something in that that is a little bit more comfortable for us as human beings to consider. But when we look at the actual data, we can see ELA proficiency on this slide, and you can notice that white students who qualify for free and reduced lunch are actually outperforming American Indian Black, and Latinx students. Similarly, when we look at math proficiency, we see the same pattern. So white students qualifying for free or reduced lunch are still outperforming American Indian, Black, and Latinx students. So what we can gather from this data is that poverty simply is not as significant a predictor as race when we're talking about our achievement gaps in Wisconsin. Okay, so when we come back then around to that 6-year high school completion data, this is a slide you've seen already. We left it to say, is it more about poverty? Is it really about race? But now we're back at this data that you saw. This data is starting to give us some information, but it's not telling us everything we need to know. So maybe we would want to ask a question like, how many Black students are actually not graduating from high school in Wisconsin? What does this mean in numbers? According to WiseDash, 7,892 Black students have not graduated since 2014. So I would say that there are many educators in Wisconsin who have the best of intentions, who do not go to work every day thinking, I'm planning to fail a subgroup of students with my practices or by maintaining this system. However, I would say that this system with these outcomes is cheating on us because it's doing something that we didn't intend it to do. When we think about this, when we look at this number, what I want us to ask ourselves and what I want you to ask your staff who push back on you when you want to do this work is, are we really prepared to let almost 8,000 Black students not graduate every 5 years? Is that something we can live with? And in my case, it's not something we can live with. In the case of everybody at the center, it's not something we can live with. So we choose to walk toward the uncomfortability of doing this work, and we choose to confront the places in our system that are not working. So this is what I mentioned when I said that to Jill that we actually have a slide coming up that talks directly about this, Is My System Cheating on Me title. And this book is part of the reason that we came up with that title. It's called Despite the Best Intentions, and it's a great read for understanding why Wisconsin schools have these significant race-based achievement gaps. And as the authors state, we have to look at the data and the evidence. Disaggregating data by looking at how specific populations of students perform will show us the path to improvement. We need to begin disaggregating data with more sophisticated methods to see what's really happening. And that's why we feel that risk ratio is a good tool and a good place to start this work. So we have a disclaimer here. And this, along with the title, was something that I kind of like puzzled through with Jill, and she helped me bring it to fruition. So hopefully it makes sense to you guys. But I was talking to her about how a square is always a rectangle, but a rectangle is not always a square. And I find that so interesting when I think about other places in life where that happens. So I want you to think about that key difference with disaggregating data as well. Risk ratio is one way to disaggregate data, but disaggregating data is not only done by risk ratio. So in other words, while we're going to teach you how to do risk ratio today, we don't want you to leave with the thought that this is the be-all, end-all, only way to investigate your data. We want you to understand that this is one way to begin to identify patterns that will predict who's going to succeed and who's going to fail in your current systems. So to jump into that, risk ratio is the probability of an event happening when comparing one group with another group. It's a first look at equity of outcomes between different enrolled groups. It's used primarily for race and ethnicity comparisons, but it can also be used for gender, ability status, or even socioeconomic status if that information is available to you. We know many schools, due to the laws, cannot get that. In Wisconsin, that typically means comparing particular educational outcomes for one enrolled subgroup to that same outcome for the enrolled white subgroup, as white students are our majority enrollment at this time. Another reason to think about white as your comparison group is because based on, oh boy, I think it's maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, there's some data out there that shows that of all of the educators in Wisconsin, 72% of us are white and female, so look like me. If people who look like me are the ones who are building and maintaining the system in the majority, then it's possible that some of our common experiences might influence how we would set that system up. So we want to use white as a subgroup or as a comparison group for those specific reasons. But just as a reference, data nerds out there, tune in. The National PBIS Center and some of the national work around risk ratio will use a comparison group of all other students. FYI. Okay, backing out of the data nerd thing. So our first example is actually not education at all. We wanted to take a step back, get kind of out of our feelings with this, and think about risk ratio in terms of something that is fairly innocent, possibly. So we're going to talk about the likelihood of getting a speeding ticket. For this to happen, A, you have to be driving. The average risk then is the likelihood that one person gets a ticket compared to the average. So since we're comparing to the average driver, the risk ratio of the average driver getting a speeding ticket is always going to be 1. But if you start to look at whether certain groups are more likely to get a ticket compared to another group, then you have a risk ratio. So men who drive a Volkswagen GTI or a certain type of Mercedes-Benz are twice as likely to get a ticket than the average driver. They might as well plan on it. In this case, we would say male drivers in these cars have a risk ratio of 2, or they're twice as likely. Interestingly, if these male drivers are in a Hummer, they have a risk ratio of 4.6, or almost 5 times the risk of a ticket compared to the average driver. Now we have the source of the ticket example here somewhere, but it's from an article. And really what we're trying to illustrate is that when you look at this, what you might tend to do, because as humans we're just designed to sort information and put things in boxes in our brains, you might tend to think to yourself, boy, here's what I know about men who drive Hummers, and sort of like dig into this hole of stereotypes that you've heard from the media or that you know from one person that you know that has a Hummer. But what we wanted to do with this example is show you this specifically so that we could point out that we don't know anything really in this data about the men who drive Hummers. What we know is that they're more likely to get a ticket, but we don't know why. When you think about a risk ratio for students, we want you to consider that same thought. Risk ratio is a first flag. It's a first wave check of whether or not things are going okay. It is not a comprehensive diagnostic data dig. So in this case, we would want to specifically get more information about what those tickets look like, where they're happening, who is getting them. All of those pieces are going to give us a clearer picture about why this is happening than just looking at this risk ratio alone. So if we start to think about risk ratio in schools, specifically for discipline referral of students, we have another way of looking at this. If there are 10 African-American students accounting for 9 referrals, that's a 0.9 referral rate. And if there are 20 students in the comparison group that account for 21 referrals, their referral rate is 1.05. So in this example, we would divide that African-American or Black referral rate by the comparison group, and the resulting number is the risk of African-American students getting a discipline referral as compared to the comparison group. So what does that mean? If you look at this table, you'll see that in this example, African-American students have actually less risk than the comparison group of getting a referral. If the number were 1, the risk would be equal. 1.25 is 25% higher. 1.50 is 50% higher, and so on. And when you go to calculate your own risk ratios, generally what we're looking for is anything 0.25 away from that 1, either positive or negative. Those are some things that we would want to dig deeper into in our data gathering. So now we're going to take those 2 examples and we're going to apply them to those graduation rates here in Wisconsin that we showed you earlier. So in Wisconsin, there were 6,138 Black students in Wisconsin high schools in 2017-18. That year, of that student group, over 4,000 of them graduated in 6 years. So 4,636, which leaves us with 1,502 students that did not graduate. That's 24.5%, almost a quarter. And that If you remember, that coincides with the graph that we saw where that graduation rate hovers around 75%. As a comparison, there were 48,307 white students in Wisconsin high schools in 2017-18. That year of that student group, oh, these are all 2018-19, sorry for that typo in my voice. But that year of that student group, 46,106 graduated in 6 years, leaving over 2,000 students that did not graduate. But when you look at that, it's actually only 4.5%. So again, correlating with the graph we showed earlier, where over 90% of students who are white are graduating. Then when we calculate risk ratio, we divide the percentage for the group that we're looking at by the comparison group. So 24.5 divided by 4.5, and that gives us the number 5.4. Meaning that in Wisconsin, our African American or Black students are 5.4 times less likely to graduate from high school in 6 years than their white peers. I'm just going to take a breath there because for me that data is quite disheartening. And I also want you to remember on the slide previously, I told you that what we're looking for is any difference of 0.25. That's where you would want to dig in to get more information. This chart doesn't even go up to 5.0. So when we look at this data, we know that we specifically have some work to do. And now, in order to do that, we'd like you to take a turn practicing this risk ratio work. So this data is high school completion rates for one school. It's an example school sorted by race and ethnicity from 2018 to 2019. If you are familiar with Wise-Public, this should look very familiar to you. And we got it directly out of there. So this same type of data is available to you for your school as well. Wise-Secure is where you would go to get more detailed data. And then I want you to notice this data tab. If you click it, you'll get data that looks like this. This is the data that fed into the chart on the previous slide. From this, it's very simple to calculate risk ratio, even easier than what we've been showing you. It's perfect. So just to verify, how we do this is we subtract that group count of the students we're looking at minus the students who didn't graduate. So that would be 12 minus 2 in the case of our example data. Or 12 minus 10, I'm sorry, in the case of our example data, equaling 2. And then we would divide that 2 by the overall group of 12 and get 17%. So that first percentage for our numerator is 17%. And then for the denominator, we would repeat that for white students. And we had a great question about this, so we'll talk about that at the end. But we have 212 minus 195, giving us 17 out of 212, which is 8%. And then finally, to calculate that risk ratio, we would divide that first percentage by the percentage of white students not graduating, and we would get a risk ratio of 2. So when we pull all that together and you get through all the data slogging of that, we can make a statement like this. Hispanic students in this example school are 2 times less likely to graduate than white students are. And that's what we're ultimately trying to get to. Because when I show people this part, or even just portions of this, it's harder to get to a conversation that is going to actively move forward. This kind of data tends to get people kind of like wandering in the muck of it and asking a lot of questions about the data. And that's all good. We need to be doing that. But we also need to get to a point where we can just explicitly say, this is what we can predict based on the outcomes we're currently getting.
And one of the things I want to point out with that is the graphs and the data chart you looked at from Wise-, those are just updated. The Wise- was upgraded this year, and you'll notice how simple that data chart was to calculate risk ratio from. I think we should put a big shout out to DPI for making that so easy. It's a lot of your data now in Wise-Public is going to be really easy to calculate risk ratio from.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Jill. We have had schools come to us for for building culturally responsive practices training or systems training for many years who struggle in our day one when we talk about their systems impact on students and families. They struggle to interpret their data in this way because they don't have access to all of it. So that change in WiseDash is monumental. That's huge. And it speaks to DPI's commitment to working on equity. DPI has much of the same messaging that we do at the center, and they clearly are focused on advancing equity and ensuring that all students are learning in our systems. So we've included some other examples of ways to use risk ratio. Frequently in PBIS land, we talk about risk ratio with behavior referrals. And if you've attended other sessions with me, even today, you would have heard me talk about how patterns across the state and across the nation indicate that students of color frequently get more behavior referrals than white students. They frequently get more intense disciplinary reactions to similar referrals than white students would get. So we talk about those patterns on a grand scale, and then what that means for our schools individually and districts. So you can do this for both major behaviors and minors. You can use this type of work for grades, like if your likelihood of being on the D or F list. Suspensions, the rate of referrals to suspensions, the most common disciplinary referral, the length of suspensions. Jill and I talked through an example of placement and AP courses, which can be really telling, not only for how your district disproportionately responds negatively, but also how they disproportionately give opportunities to some students over others. So these can be ways to examine both ends of the spectrum. Graduation rates you saw today and attendance rates. So we're going to do one last poll. We'd like you to commit to disaggregating and using risk ratio within the next month with some data. And we know that this is a huge ask with the state of the times now and the fact that we're in a global pandemic, and many of us don't know what we'll be doing in a month with our kids, with our jobs. It's all up in the air. So within the next month, maybe two, we'd like you to identify which data you're going to commit to looking into and trying to disaggregate or run a risk ratio with. And Jill has started that poll. Oh, I love seeing the AP class enrollment and AP test scores. Great job, guys. Suspension, expulsion, grades.
Well, wasn't it in Amy's keynote yesterday where she talked about studying time out of class? I think that could even be, we could do some risk ratio around time out of class.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any time out of class is lost instruction, as Dr. Neese said 2 days ago as well.
Oh, is that when it was? Yeah.
They may have both said it, but even those low-level things that we think, oh, this isn't a big deal, I'm just going to remove them for a few minutes so that I can get a break, even those few minutes in a cumulative effect lead to really poor outcomes for students. So we have to be very conscientious about this work. What I love about these results, it looks like almost 70% of you have voted, thank you. And what I love is that we're seeing a complete array across all of this data. So what this tells me is that across the state, we will hopefully have people disaggregating data like crazy whenever you get back to whatever is our new normal in an office or at a computer.
Yeah. All right, it's been up for 1.5 minutes, so I think I'm going to end the poll in the next few seconds. So if you want your voice heard, get it in. All right, I'm ending the poll now.
Perfect.
And here are the results.
Yes, behavior referrals. Way to go, PBISers.
But look there's a lot of attendance too. That's great because of course if school works, but if kids aren't in school and aren't present in the instruction, it's not going to work. Exactly. Great.
And there's so much in our universal systems that so much of what we do sends messages to kids unintentionally. And we're telling them, even if we're not aware of it, that they do or don't fit in our building. And a lot of that is reflected in attendance data. So even while it might feel like that's not something that's within our control, It might be easy to go back to that slide where we talk about the pink, the underperforming words. What we need to do is shift that conversation when you go and disaggregate that data, you awesome 17 people who said attendance. You need to shift that to talk about what in our system is sending these kids the message that they don't fit in our schools, that it's better to not come, that it's easier to not come. And then think about how you can change that systemically, not just saving one student at a time. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in that. So we are at about the tail end of our presentation here for today, and we've managed to save some time for questions, which I'm very excited about. But we want you to think about your next steps. So now that you've committed to that data, maybe we should have left the poll up so you could write that down, but maybe you'll all remember because you're probably more with it than me. But now that you've committed to disaggregating that data, we want you to think about who else needs to be involved in this work. We know that you'll need to bring in staff stakeholders, most likely. We also know that in order for our systems to be responsive to families and students, we have to have family and student voice. So without tapping into those stakeholders, we will never have systems that fully meet their needs. This is collaborative work, and it has to happen with people who are impacted. We want you to think about when and where this would fit in your problem-solving process. So if you have a problem-solving process and it's happening on a weekly, monthly, semesterly basis, this needs to be embedded. This work of risk ratio and disaggregating data needs to be embedded in that plan. If you don't have a process or a plan or it calendared out, we would like you to do that. Make sure that you have a systemic plan to address this work. The third question, which problems exist that you'd like to further investigate? And what are the outcomes that you would like to impact? And within this, I want you to specifically consider which problems your staff or your stakeholders might identify. And if those aren't the same, I want you to consider leaning into the ones that your stakeholders would identify first, because that's how you'll get their buy-in and that's how you'll get them engaged in the work of doing this. And then finally at the bottom, what do you need to do to make sure you have the right or accurate data or access to the data? And it looks like, of all of you who've attended, it looks like we're getting great poll responses, like you have access and you know how to find things, and that's awesome. If you need help, please, please, please let us know. Either Jill and I or your regional tax, anybody from the center can get you in the right direction. We also offer a risk ratio module on our, I believe it's on our YouTube page. So if you need a refresher from what we talked about today, or you want to sit down with a team and do something like the activity we did today, you can use this on our YouTube page, this link, or I believe that this session was recorded, and if you want to see these jokes again, you could absolutely play that for a team and enjoy the hilarity of it. We have some additional resources as well. When we talk about disaggregating data and equity, there are some great go-to places to have on your list or to have bookmarked in your browser. One is the U.S. Department of Education Safe and Supportive Schools Center. Additionally, the U.S. Department of Ed OSEP, Office of Special Education Programming, gathers a ton of great data on what the national patterns are, so that would be another place to look. Wisconsin's Disproportionality Technical Assistance Network has amazing resources and an amazing staff to help address the needs that we're seeing in our state. And also, if you remember, they built the slides that talk about whether poverty or free and reduced lunch is a stronger indicator than race, that clearly illustrate that race is a stronger indicator in our state right now in terms of academic gaps. The Great Lakes Equity Center has amazing resources as well. The National Center on PBIS has a strong focus on equity right now, and that has been going on for quite a few years. And they're building guides and building tools that help address specifically PBIS implementation. But if you're fluent enough at PBIS and you can do some of the code switching that would be required for just the terminology, it easily applies to multi-level systems of support as well. So RTI, all of those pieces. And finally, we have some time here for questions or for feedback. I know we had a couple questions come up throughout the
Sure.
presentation.
Yep, and we actually just got a really great idea from Paula. It's about using risk ratio to look more closely at student response to tier 2 or tier 3 interventions by disaggregated groups. So we could look at which students responded positively to our interventions versus those who did not, disaggregate it by race or by gender, and then do risk ratio with that. So that's a great idea. Another thing you could commit to. But yes, we have a really awesome question here about, from Olivia. Thank you, Olivia. I completely hear those reasons for using white peers as the comparison group. And I think it's worth conversation about how that can contribute to the white is standard mentality that is so intertwined with the white racial frame. Do you have suggestions for navigating that balance?
So Jill read me that question when everyone was in the breakout rooms, and I thought to myself, boy, I really want to be prepared to answer it. And I feel like I'm still not 100% prepared. And that is something that I think speaks to the nature of this work, that frequently we end up in situations where we're having to have conversations that we're not 100% prepared for. And I'm speaking to this as a white female. So I have been working with culturally responsive practices and race and diversity and trying to make an impact for quite a few years now. And I feel that I'm never out of that zone of like learning and growing. So it's messy. That was the whole point. But you bring up an amazing point that the work that we're doing through this, if we do it on a surface level, if we disaggregate data on a surface level, or we use white as a comparison group on a surface level, just very technically, without having deeper conversations, we run the risk of reinforcing what's called either stereotype threat or reinforcing this idea that white is normal. So yes, and I think my best advice, which is definitely flawed, is to just dig deeper into the conversation and talk about it. Because if we don't talk about it, if we don't call to light what we're seeing and what our concerns are, then they could linger there under the surface and they could be happening without us addressing them. So I don't know if it was Olivia, I believe. So if you had some ideas between now and when you ask the question, you'd like to put those in the chat, you go right ahead. Or if anyone else has other ideas, that would be great as well. But I think we have to keep coming back to the fact that when we're doing disaggregating data this way, and we use white as a comparison group, what we're really trying to do is establish that our systems are working for white students overall. And if our systems are working for white students overall, then we would compare any other student to them because we want to know why and how they're not working for other groups. So I guess that would be my kind of blanket response. But I think it really would require some deep discussion if that's something that comes up when you're doing this work.
Yes, we've gotten several comments on your response and about what you just said, that it's really helpful, very interesting, and just that this is a way to acknowledge that our systems have historically served white students and not students of color. And this metric helps us see the magnitude of that. So that's awesome. Is that just historically, this is a way to try to quantify the service to white students and not students of color. Someone else asked about, since you had mentioned the percent of teachers in Wisconsin that were white female, someone had asked about administrators. And so I dug into WiseDash while everybody was in their small groups. And I pulled out the data for, first of all, district administrators. You have to do it, in administrators, you have to do it by license type in WiseDash Public. And so I did it just for district administrators. And right now, out of our 445 district administrators, 316 are white men. So that's 71% of our district administrators are white men. And so then Mulaney asked me could I double check the teaching staff? So that is a little bit easier because the teachers are a much larger group. So right now, 95% of our teachers in Wisconsin are white, And of those, 69% are white females.
Did
So
you say 95?
95% are white. Yeah.
So what I want to highlight for you all, and I am pretty vulnerable when I present. I think a lot of you know this. I'm the kind of person who I don't hide a whole lot of who I am when I'm doing this work. I think it's messy. I think it's hard. And I think that we have to kind of own that and celebrate it when it's happening. So I just want to point out that the kind of data digging in the moment, the kind of questions that you're asking in the moment that Jill is going and finding the answers to are highlighting exactly what we need to be able to do in our schools. We need to make space to ask questions like this, whether it's about the state overall, the nation, our district, or our building. We need the space to ask questions and for our minds to be triggered to be thinking about this. B, second, I don't remember what I started with, A or 1, but whatever it is, the second thing is you need someone in your school or on your team with you who is great at going in and digging up data. And for us, many of us in the center are very fluent at looking at data. It's a great thing. We all work on it a lot. But Jill on our team, our regional team, she's just an immediate go-to person for if you need it right that second, if you need it during the session, she's going to go look it up and she'll have it for you, and she's dependable. So grow that person on your team. Help someone become that person. Take some things off of their plate so that that's a job that they can do, because this is the kind of work that we need to do in order to see where our system might be cheating on us, where we might not be doing things to fidelity and getting outcomes that we don't want. So, were there other questions, Jill, or should I keep?
We actually, I can see that everyone's really started thinking now, because we're getting people thinking about, what about students that might be homeless or unaccompanied youth, or how could we compare, look at the different approaches we have and look at who's thriving and who's traditionally marginalized. And it's thinking about, well, maybe it's not always a white comparison, but what group is doing the best in our school. So I can see that everyone's really started thinking about this, which, as we know as teachers, once you start applying what you've learned to other scenarios, that is that transfer of learning. And so I would say, to me, this is a sign that we've been successful, Malini, because they're starting to apply this to other situations. So great job, participants.
Good work, everyone. And I will say one caveat that I want to bring to light is that it's amazing to think about all the ways to apply this type of data dig. And I'm glad that everyone's branching out and thinking broadly. I do want to call to light one thing that I just feel I would be remiss in not mentioning, which is that many of the demographics seem to be easier to look at than race. So I will tell you, I've had these conversations in schools that I've worked in schools that were in the same district I worked in, and now as a technical assistance coordinator, I've had them with teams from a district, from a CISA, from a building level. And it is much easier for us as human beings to think about things in terms of anything but race, really. So what I want to caution you on is, yes, absolutely, use this data in every possible, use this tool in every way possible with all the data that you can think of. And always, please, please, please come back to the students who have the worst outcomes in our state. Come back to our students who are Black, who are Native American, who are Latinx, and look at their outcomes in your district and in your building and ensure that they are having their needs met as well. And that you as a staff and as a school are doing everything you possibly can to ensure that your system, not just you one by one, but your system is wrapping its arms around them and giving them what they need. So with that, I'm just going to bring us back quickly to our session outcomes. We wanted to teach you the value of disaggregating data. We wanted to talk about common data that you could disaggregate. You all committed to disaggregating data, which is awesome. And we wanted to give you some practice in how this might work. So with that, reach out, Twitter, email, your regional TAC, anyone at the center can either answer your questions or get you to someone who can. And with that, I thank you.